Well, we're delighted today to have Duncan Wyatt from the AHDB, who's going to give us a little bit of insight on their view, what's happening in the market. Hi, Duncan. Great to have you with us today.
Hello, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Obviously, we have seen a huge demand in meat during the last 12 months and the COVID pandemic. How's that translated to cattle throughput?
Yeah, really good actually. So in the early days of COVID, we essentially saw the food service market close, and a lot of that demand moved. Well, actually, almost all of it moved into retail. So people went out and bought mince initially, and then the market sort of sorted itself out, discounted some steaks, and actually we started to balance the carcass. So initially in 2020, we were expecting a reduction in production. And the reason for that is, if you cast your mind back to 2018, we had a terrible spring, and unfortunately we lost a few calves and cows. So that was going to come through to lower production in 2020. But actually beef demand, and particularly beef demand for British beef, has done really well. And actually throughputs have been maintained, and production last year was actually higher than in 2019, which we weren't really expecting. What that's meant is farmers have brought cattle forward a little bit. They've been slaughtered at slightly younger ages, but that's meant a tightness in supply now, which is probably going to last for a few more months.
And will we see an uptake in calf registrations due to this?
It's possible. So obviously, as I mentioned, in 2018 we saw a reduction in registrations, but that was because of mortality, unfortunately. Last year we actually saw registrations pretty stable compared to 2019. There's quite a lot of uncertainty in the beef industry at the moment going forwards in terms of single payments and things like that. But at the moment, registrations are relatively stable. We're expecting a little bit of a contraction in the herd next year, both in the dairy herd and the suckler herd. But broadly speaking, nothing too dramatic. A lot of farmers that we think are in kind of wait and see mode in terms of how those ELMS payments are going to play out, how the single payment starts to get reduced as well. And so, yeah, relatively stable at the moment, probably a slight contraction in both herds.
Interesting. And we've seen a bit of an interest in named breeds. I know there has been a bit of change in retail, but is that having an effect, particularly in the dairy herd?
Yeah, that's right. Really good question. So we've seen a lot more use of sexed semen in the dairy herd. What that does, it frees up farmers to use more beef semen as well. So we're seeing more beef coming out of the dairy herd in terms of, for instance, Angus breeds and things like that. A little bit more Herefords as well, perhaps. And so, yeah, actually, if you look at native breeds, let's take Angus, Hereford, and Shorthorns together. They constitute probably a third of all registrations now, and a lot of those are coming out of the dairy herd.
And obviously the knock-on effect of this is demand from an importation point of view, and Brexit rolled into that as well. How's the AHDB seen the sort of EU importation of beef and any changes over the last 12 months?
Yeah, so UK imports of European beef have actually dropped from Ireland and other European countries as well. And again, because COVID closed the food service market and imported beef does relatively well in food service, that meant our demand for imported beef dropped off. That demand moved into retail, butchers and other things as well. And so demand for British beef in particular has been higher, which is why we've produced more as well to meet that demand. Prices have been really good as well. So I think what might happen is, as the vaccine rolls out and as COVID as the lockdown from COVID starts to ease throughout the year, what we'll probably see is that demand move back towards food service as people get confidence about going out and eating out in restaurants again. And we'll probably see at that point, relatively speaking, a little bit of a reduction in demand for British cattle in particular, and that we might see prices receiving a little bit less support towards the end of the year. But we'll have to wait and see really about how it goes. Definitely at the moment, the big effect of COVID was a reduction in imports for beef into the UK. Brexit is another kind of matter, and certainly January trade, both imports and exports, both contracted quite sharply in January as people were getting their head around the paperwork in terms of what it means to export to Europe now. And imported beef was actually a lot lower as well. I think a lot of people got ahead of the game a little bit and did some more trade before Christmas time. We were staring down the idea of maybe a no deal, in which case there would have been tariffs applied, and actually imports and exports both reduced quite markedly in January, it looks like.
Fascinating. Duncan, really appreciate your time today, spending some time and the insights from the HDB and your own personal viewpoint, and I'm sure we'll see you again. Thanks very much indeed.